Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. This afternoon I'm going to talk about Samatha meditation, that is meditation towards jhana. As you're probably aware, there are fundamentally two different approaches to meditation, and each has its purpose and its use and is part of a balanced practice. One is samatha and the other is vipassana. Vipassana is the examination of reality by means of observing the mental objects precisely, clearly, one after the other. The other kind of meditation, which I'm going to focus on today, is samatha, which is meditation leading towards greater tranquility, peacefulness, stability of the mind, and the perfection of the meditation is jhana. The basic characteristic of any samatha meditation is that you try and stabilize the mind on a single object. In our tradition, we commonly use the breath, but there are many other possibilities. Some people do very well with a kasina meditation. Kasina is taking a physical object, commonly a colored disc. There's a list in the Sudimagga of different kasinas. You take an actual physical object like a colored disc or a bowl of water is another one, and try and fill the mind with that, either that color or the element or whatever the kasina is, using the visual sense, and you stabilize the mind on that. Brahma-vihara meditations are also kind of samatha, and the stabilization there is on the mental formation of that state, that tone of mind, whether it's loving kindness or compassion. So there's a wide variety. With mindfulness of breathing, you're using the physical sense of touch. And this general principle in these samatha meditations is that you try and limit the object to one sense base. So I'll mostly focus on the example of mindfulness of breathing, although much of this will apply to any samatha meditation. The practice is to fill the mind with the object, which is an arbitrarily chosen one. You decide, I'm going to do meditation on the breath, or I'm going to do meditation on a kasina, and then you focus your mind on that. Primary quality that's required is samadhi, and I think this is very important to understand what is meant by samadhi. You've probably all heard me mention before that I don't like the current translation that you often see for samadhi. The standard is concentration, which I think is dead wrong. I think it's very misleading, and I've seen that with people, meditators, that a very common failing in attempting to do samatha meditation is pushing too hard with the mind. And this, at least in part, comes from the idea of concentrating on the breath. You shouldn't think of it in terms of concentrating on the breath, but of filling the mind with the breath. I think it's a useful way to look at it is, instead of forcing the mind onto the object, you let the object fill the mind. The mind should be still, peaceful, open, and receptive. It's not actively pushing outwards onto the object, but allowing the object to fill the mind. So a particular skill that needs to be developed here is quite opposite from Vipassana meditation, the skill of non-attention. With Vipassana meditation, every object is a valid object of meditation, every Dhamma that arises. So if it's done properly, there are no distractions. There's just a variety of objects. But with a Samatha meditation, when something else other than your chosen object impinges on the mind, which it will, inevitably, either internal objects like thoughts and memories, or external objects like sounds or smells, the skill is to disregard them, let them fade by non-attention. Take no interest in them. And also not a negative interest. You don't try and push them away or squash them. You just disregard them. You learn that skill of non-attention. A reasonable simile is if you're sitting at home reading a book and your roommate or your partner or somebody in your family is in the next room watching TV. You can hear the TV in the background, but if you're focusing on your book, you can screen it out and just read and disregard the sound of the TV. It only becomes distracting and annoying if you go out listening to it, if you pay attention to it. So this is like the random thoughts that arise in the mind. You just disregard them and let them fade away into the background, and they'll peter out if they're not fed energy. So the real meaning of samadhi is not concentration. It's defined in the old text, like the Visuddhimagga and the Abhidhamma. It's defined as non-wavering. So that means like stability or stillness. It's not a narrow state of mind. It's a broad, vast, expansive state of mind, but it's not leaping from object to object. It's rock solid on a single object. So as the samadhi deepens, as the mind becomes more and more stable, you will naturally feel more peaceful, more calm, a sense of well-being, and there's a gradual movement into the states that are called jhanas. Now, if you go to the literature, if you read books written by different Buddhist teachers on jhana, or if you listen to many talks by different ajahns and rinpoches and whatnot on jhana, you're not going to find a topic with more disagreement and more confusion of terms. It seems to be all over the place. Everybody's got their own take on it. So I'd like to suggest a way of looking at it that I find useful, and it cuts through a lot of the problems of different interpretations. Instead of thinking of the jhanas so much as discrete, sharply defined states, think of samadhi as a spectrum, a continuum, and gradually deepening samadhi. And as guidelines or signposts, we define certain regions of that spectrum as first, second, third, fourth jhana. And I think a lot of the discrepancies between different teachers' approach can be interpreted as just defining a different section of that spectrum. That what one teacher calls first jhana, the another one will say, no, that's not really first jhana yet. That's not quite first jhana. So if you don't get hung up on definitions, a lot of it is just semantic problems, and just look at it as trying to deepen the samadhi continuously. That takes out a lot of the issues that arise in terms of definition. Another misapprehension I see commonly talking about the jhanas is people tend to think of them as something very esoteric and unobtainable, something very far away and mysterious. Whereas actually I think it's very common for meditators to occasionally dip in and out of jhana, to have some taste of it or experience of it. That's quite a different thing from having some degree of mastery of being able to sit in it continuously. But I think most people who meditate seriously, they're in and out of jhana. They touch on it. They have some idea of what it means intuitively. I don't think it's that remote as people think. And it's also wrong to think of the jhanas as gaining something, attaining something, going somewhere, like it's something new, something strange. It's actually a very natural state of mind. And it's not really gaining anything at all. It's simplifying the mind. And the whole progress through the four jhanas is a process of purification and simplification. It's a natural tendency of the mind to shift into jhana when, or towards jhana and into jhana when the five hindrances are made quiescent. So they're the things that keep us, they're like brakes or bindings that keep us from naturally deepening the state of consciousness into deeper samadhi and into jhana. The hindrances in nivarana are a particular list of factors. They're one of the lists of defilements, and they specifically relate to meditation. And they are the mind states that prevent the mind from deepening the samadhi. They are sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness, and uncertainty. This first one, sensual desire, kama chanda, in the context of meditation, particularly, it doesn't refer only to obvious gross forms of sensual desire like desire for food or sex, but to any movement of the mind out through the sense doors, taking interest in objects of the senses. This is why on a meditation retreat, practicing sense restraint is a very, very important aspect. And this makes sense because jhana is a state of consciousness that has transcended the sense desire realm. And as long as you're playing around in the sense objects, you're caught in that lowest tier of consciousness. You're not transcending that. No? So, for an example, if you're doing walking meditation and you're letting yourself get, interested in the butterflies or the flowers or looking at the trees or something, that in itself, that's not a defilement, that's not something wrong, but it will stop you from deepening your samadhi. It is a mistake in terms of meditation practice. You're indulging in the senses. You're going out through the senses. So if you're serious about deepening the samadhi, you don't do that. Ill will is the second one, vyapada, and that's broadly defined as any kind of negative mind state. And it's the obvious ones like anger, hatred, but it's also minor, subtle ones like irritation, allowing yourself to be bothered by small discomforts in the meditation posture, the seating, or the temperature in the room. If you allow them to bother you, then you're falling into vyapada, and that also binds you to that lowest tier of sense desire consciousness. You're caught in that level, and your samadhi can't progress any further. Sloth and torpor, tinamida, is dullness, sleepiness, heaviness of consciousness. And anyone who's done meditation for a while has probably had experiences of this, the difficulty of, rousing energy, being bright and waking up. Though it's very important to snap out of it if you're falling into that. And it's important to recognize that it's not skillful or appropriate at that time to try and gain more samadhi, because it becomes a kind of a false samadhi. It becomes a kind of hypnotic dullness. If you're having trouble staying awake, if you're getting into dullness, the first order of business should be to try and wake up. So that means kind of letting go on the narrow focus and do things like meditate with eyes open, which will introduce more distraction, yes, but by introducing light into the consciousness, that can help wake you up. A walking meditation, walking more briskly. If it's very difficult, if it's chronic kind of dullness, then things like splashing your face with cold water. One actually really good one is to do a short walk outdoors in bare feet in the snow. That's very effective in waking you up. So the fourth one is restlessness. It's actually a double word in Pali, uducha kakucha, which some translators have tried to be clever and carry on the rhyming sense of the word. And you'll see it translated sometimes as worry and flurry. Uducha kakucha. Um, Uducha is restlessness, and the kakucha is anxiety. So it is the mind that sort of, it's not still in the sense that it's running around thinking of this and that. Worry has that nature of obsessing the thoughts, and restlessness is a little different but related. It's an inability to keep still mentally or physically. And this is somewhat of an opposite defilement to sloth and torpor. At the time when uducha kakucha are present, the important thing is to emphasize stillness. You do your best to deepen the stillness and stability aspect of the samadhi. And that begins by being very still physically. And this can often be difficult if you're caught in restlessness. The body can feel twitchy, but you need to disregard that and stay still until you get through it. A good rule is you never overcome restlessness by giving into it or appeasing it. The mind is very creative when your restlessness hits to try and think of 101 things you ought to be doing right now instead of sitting still. And you have to just disregard that and just stay there. And the final one is uncertainty or skeptical doubt, wicikitcha, which is the inability of the mind to surrender to the practice. At least that, it has maybe a broader meaning in other contexts, but it's particularly in terms of the meditation, having faith or saddha or confidence means you just do the practice. You just surrender to it. You just do it. You don't fuss about, is this correct? And Ajahn so-and-so said something different. And, you don't worry about that. You just do it. And it'll sort itself out with time. You know? The very common motif in many of the spiritual stories is the illiterate, ignorant peasant or farmer who goes to see the great master, and the great master is surrounded by all his learned disciples, and he's very dismissive of this bumpkin, and he just says, "Oh, okay, you want some instruction? Just go sit under a tree and watch your breath." And the guy says, "Oh, thank you, master, thank you," and he goes and does it, and he attains all sorts of high states of meditation very quickly because he has complete faith and surrender to the practice, just doing it. So when those five hindrances are quiescent, that's really all that needs to be done. That's the essential bit. And it isn't really an effort after that. The mind just naturally gravitates into deeper samadhi. So if you're not advancing in your samadhi, you should consider and examine which of these nivaranas are giving you difficulty and work on it. But when they're quiescent, then the mind will naturally gravitate deeper into samadhi. And I'll say a bit now about the progression through the jhanas in terms of the five jhana factors. These are factors of mind that are associated particularly with the different states of jhana. And if you consider this list and how they relate and work, you can see the theme that this is a progression of greater simplification and purification. You're not really gaining anything anywhere along the line. You're removing or making quiescent various coarse states, and the mind naturally gravitates to the more subtle, sublime states. So in the ordinary state of consciousness, the daily default consciousness of human beings is what's called a sense desire level consciousness, where we're primarily relating to everything through the five senses. And even our mental activity tends to focus around sense objects. When this is made quiescent and the hindrances are quiescent, then the mind moves toward first jhana, which includes the five factors of vitakka, vichara, piti, sukha, and ekaggata. Vitakka and vichara, and the translations of all of these tend to be obscure, problematic, controverted, so I'll go through them. Vitakka and vichara are mental factors to do with application of mind. Sustained and applied thought is a common translation. Another is initial and sustained application of mind. There are different ways of translating them. Vitakka is the striking of the object with the mind, and vichara is the holding of the object with the mind. Especially outside the context of jhana, they're often expressed in Pali as a compound, vitakka vichara, because they're really two closely related mental states. And in the ordinary stream of consciousness, they're the energy that's involved in thinking. Verbal thinking and speech require vitakka vichara, because you're manipulating mental objects. The vitakka strikes the object and vichara holds it. So between the two, they manipulate mental objects. The Visuddhimagga has a series of similes to express vitakka vichara, and for example, vitakka vichara together are like polishing a brass candlestick. Vichara is the hand that holds the candlestick, and vitakka is the hand that rubs it. You know? There's a number of these sort of similes. One that's, I think, kind of useful to contemplate is striking a gong. If you're trying to get a steady tone, keep a steady tone going with a gong, you need to strike it with the striker, and then the tone will gradually fade, and when it gets too low, you strike it again. And the tone is like vichara, and the striking is like vitakka. And this has a very significant or useful implication to meditation practice, because holding the mental object requires the occasional use of vitakka. When the grip on the object loosens and the mind starts to wander, shift a little bit, then you can bring in this little mental forcefulness of bringing it back. That's vitakka. But if you're constantly doing that, then you're going to be weary, and it's like striking the gong again and again and again. It doesn't make a nice sound. So you use vitakka sparingly, and vichara is the holding of the object. And the holding of the object should be steady, not too tight, not too loose. A simile that's sometimes used is like holding a raw egg in your hand. If you hold it too tightly, obviously you're going to squash it and make a mess. If you hold it too loosely, it'll fall on the floor and you'll make another kind of mess. So, but if you hold it just right, just firm enough. You know? So with vitakka vichara are two of the factors. Then another two are piti and sukha. They're also closely related. Translated often as rapture and bliss, or zest and happiness. There's a few different variations, but they're both joyful states of consciousness, states of well-being, a feeling tone of happiness. The difference is that piti tends to be more energetic, kind of thrilling, so that's why it's sometimes translated rapture. And it has very commonly bodily or physical correlates or side effects. That when piti is felt, you'll feel it in the body as goosebumps or spine rushes or tingles. There's many different varieties. The highest form of piti is what's called uplifting piti, where you feel very light and buoyant, and you can actually have a kind of subjective feeling like you're levitating. And it can feel so sort of realistic. If you haven't felt this strongly before, you might get alarmed the first time it happens, and you open your eyes to see if you're actually floating. You know, but it's a subjective feeling. It's a feeling of like not being affected by gravity. One little piece of advice, of meditation advice, is sometimes meditators will spontaneously move in the meditation, like forward and backwards or round and round, sort of the body sort of doing a bit of stuff. That if that happens, the best advice is to gently, subside that and be still. Not too forcefully. You don't want to break it, because what's happening is this is a very low, crude form of piti that's coming up. And if you subdue the physical motion without being too violent or abrupt about it, so you don't break that energy, but you just subdue it, it'll sublimate. It'll become a more subtle form of piti, more internalized. Sukha is happiness that's not associated with physical side effects, except for a feeling of physical well-being. I just feel easy and at peace, but there's no sort of thrilling or movement to it. And it's a sort of oceanic feeling. It's just very, very calm, blissful feeling. And the fifth factor is ekagata, which is commonly translated one-pointedness, and that's another translation that I think has a misleading effect on people's meditation, because we're not really trying to get the mind to one point. We're trying to get the mind still on a single object. So the way Pali works, compound words are very common, and ekagata is one of these compounds. And they're often ambiguous about how you can resolve the compound. A famous one is Tathagata, which is one of the names of the Buddha, which could mean either thus gone or thus come. And it's like a deliberately ambiguous, I think. It could be depending on how you break up the compound. And it's a similar thing with ekagata. It could also be read as gone to oneness or gone to unity. And I think that's the better way to think of it. You're trying to unify the mind. So the mind isn't divided against itself doing this and that. It's still on a single object. So it's a unified mind. But it's not a narrow point. That's very important to get away from that idea. So first jhana is defined as a state of mind that has these factors and is secluded from sense field. Now the sense objects at that point are those things which you've just left behind. They're not very far outside. So there's still maybe some trace of sense impression, but you're not looking at the senses or paying attention to them. And there's a saying that sound is a thorn to first jhana. And what that means is because sense impression is not very far away, and it's the coarser factor you've just transcended, it can still pull you back and pull you out. So if there's a loud, sharp sound, someone slams a door, car backfires, you could, unless your meditation is very strong, you can lose that jhana and slip back. So any wandering back into the senses will drop you out of first jhana. And now in first jhana, the coarsest factors remaining are vitakka and vichara. Thought formation is the coarsest thing going on, the crudest thing, and it starts to seem and feel, taste crude to the mind. And the mind transcends it, moves beyond that, and now the sense objects are far away. They're not an issue anymore in second jhana, but thought formation can pull you back. You might get interested or tempted by some thought formation. One of Ajahn Brahm's most well-known popular sayings, if you find yourself wondering, am I in second jhana? The answer is no. And here in second jhana, we have just the three factors of piti, sukha, and ekagata, and piti is predominant. This is the level where the piti is strongest. It's the predominant factor. And that starts to seem coarse, gross to the mind, and the mind begins to diminish the piti, favoring the sukha, this feeling of calm, peaceful, blissful abiding. And the kind of thrilling aspects of busyness of piti begins to seem coarse and gross and not desired. And the mind settles into a deeper state of third jhana, which has only the factors of sukha and ekagata. So you see how we're going here. We're less and less factors. So it's purification and simplification. And we're moving always from the gross to the subtle. And those are relative terms. What seems subtle at one stage seems gross to the next stage. So at third jhana, sukha is the predominant feeling tone, but even that, even bliss, eventually starts to seem coarse, heavy, and fourth jhana is left only with equanimity, upekkha, and ekagata. And upekkha at that stage is a profound peacefulness. Well, this is not the same upekkha as just a neutral feeling. This is a profound peacefulness. And so that's the four rupa jhanas. Then there's also four arupa jhanas, formless states. Boundless space, boundless consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception or non-perception. So there's even more subtle states yet beyond fourth jhana. But even the most subtle of these states is still conditioned, is still within samsara. It's not full awakening. So the question comes up sometimes, people wonder then, why should I bother doing samadhi meditation? Why should I pay any attention to jhanas? It's not the final release. There is, I find in some circles in Western Buddhist teachers, there is a kind of prejudice against jhanas and samadhi meditation. But that's not, that can't be found or justified from the suttas and from the Buddha's own teachings. He spoke often of developing samadhi and the importance of samatha. In fact, when you read suttas and commentaries in English translation, when you see the verb to meditate, or he meditates, or meditating, then it's most often a translation of janeti, which literally means to do jhana. So it's almost synonymous with meditation. And why do we do it? And the Buddha gave several benefits of doing samatha meditation. The first is a peaceful abiding here and now, blameless pleasure divorced from the senses. So it feels good. It's a great feeling of well-being, and it has that kind of mentally healing and centering aspect. The other benefit is that as a precursor to vipassana, it's actually very difficult to do vipassana properly without a strong basis in samatha work. It's very difficult, and it can feel painful. It's like dragging the mind through broken glass. And the mind is very confused when you start to try and do vipassana with a confused and scattered mind. It's very difficult. So the optimal time to do vipassana is after developing some samadhi. And when the Buddha talks about a path to full awakening, and he gives some variations, there isn't just one technique that suits everybody all the time. But the one he talks about most is going through first, second, third, fourth jhana, and then turning the mind to investigation and release. And it seems like the optimal time for actually penetrating reality is on emergence from jhana. That said, you cannot do investigation or vipassana while you're in jhana because it's contradictory. The mind is still, it's unable to do any kind of investigation. I also think it's a very good meditation to do and to develop at all times. Mindfulness of breathing in particular was recommended by the Buddha as being suitable for everyone. Like other meditations or different personality types will take to it, but mindfulness of breathing is suitable for everyone, and there's no harm can come from it. There's a story in the Vinaya where the Buddha was teaching on corpse meditation, and some of the monks took it too far, and they started developing a fear and loathing of the body, and some even killed themselves to shed this foul body. And when the Buddha became aware of what was going on, he told them to stop and do mindfulness of breathing. He said, no one ever came to harm through doing mindfulness of breathing. You can't really do it too much or wrong or make yourself crazy with it. So, and I think just as a practical note that depending on your particular circumstances, but if you've got a lot of stress and difficulties in your daily life, and you have a limited amount of time to meditate, you'll get the most benefit from doing samatha meditation. If you've got like a half an hour or an hour of time in the morning or evening, you'll get the most benefit from doing samatha meditation. That's what your mind and your being needs more than anything, is some peacefulness. And trying to do vipassana in short bursts like that is often not very productive. But you can do mindfulness of breathing for an hour and feel mentally refreshed and calmed and energized. So I think I'll leave you with those words and open it up for questions.